Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Brendan Cole. Stop all the clocks. Well, Big Ben at least. The chimes of the great clock at Westminster are to be silenced as a mark of respect during the ceremonial funeral for Lady Thatcher. Supporters say she deserves it. The epitaphs have been flowing thick and fast for the first ever female Prime Minister. Newspaper editorials have outlined the ways she transformed the Conservative Party, and even those who oppose her admit her influence is felt in British politics to this day. Does Margaret Thatcher warrant such a ceremonial funeral that carries a £10 million price tag? And how will history judge her both domestically and internationally? Well, joining me in the studio is Michael Cockerell, who's a journalist and BBC documentary maker who interviewed Margaret Thatcher several times. Also joining me is Iain Dale, who's a broadcaster for the radio station LBC and is author of the book Memories of Margaret Thatcher. Nigel Willmott is also here in the studio. He's the letters editor for the Guardian newspaper. And on the line, Peter Tatchell, human rights campaigner and director of the London-based Peter Tatchell Foundation. Well, Michael Cockerell, Churchill, he never had an ism named after him, but he only got 45 minutes of tributes when he died. What do you think of the 7 hours and 30 minutes of tributes that were paid to Margaret Thatcher last week? What would she have made of it, do you think?
Oh, she'd have loved it. Most of it was extraordinarily favourable, but she wanted to be noticed. She was a leader who wanted to make a difference. She wanted to be distinct from the succession of, as you would have put it, men in grey suits who conformed with each other and had consensus. The prophet, she said, never said, "This is the consensus, follow me. These are my convictions, unite behind my convictions."
Iain Dale, she would have found it a bit sycophantic, though, wouldn't she?
She wasn't averse to the odd bit of sycophancy, it has to be said. Although, I mean, all the myth about her just wanting a load of yes men in her cabinet is exactly that, a myth. She did actually like a good old argument. But I think it was quite appropriate for those tributes to be made. No one forced any MPs to make the speeches. They did it of their own free will. Nigel
Willmott, letters editor for the Guardian newspaper. I suppose your newspaper has received comments on whether or not Parliament should have been recalled. I mean, what's your view? It could have waited till the Monday, couldn't it? And at considerably less expense to the taxpayer.
As far as the recall of Parliament is concerned, I'm not wildly upset about it. I probably could have waited, and it was probably too long. But she was a major Prime Minister. It would have happened at some point. I think it's the scale of the funeral which is more upsetting to most of our readers.
The Conservatives are actually blaming Gordon Brown for agreeing to the scale of the funeral back in 2008. So does this suggest that perhaps the Conservatives didn't want such a kind of funeral in the first place?
I don't have access to those elevated kind of decision-making circles. But, I mean, I think it is a fault of New Labour that they did pump up the reputation of Margaret Thatcher too much. And I think Gordon Brown, when he was struggling after autumn 2007, when he made that big mistake, clutched at Margaret Thatcher and tried to be, the heir to Thatcher as Blair was. And I think they may well be responsible for it.
Iain Dale, £10 million price tag. That's a little bit too much, isn't it? It's a state funeral in all but name.
I don't know how you can put a price on these things. Everyone's saying 10 million. We don't know it's costing 10 million. The figure I heard was 3 or 4 million. Now, there'll be people that think that's too much. I mean, she was an iconic Prime Minister. If we can't spend a little bit of money on a proper send-off to somebody like this, there are going to be 2,500 people at the funeral. I mean, I feel privileged. I'm going to be one of them. But the list of people that they've released that are coming, there are people coming from all over the world. Are we seriously suggesting that they should be in a little church in a village somewhere outside London?
Peter Tatchell, I'd like to bring in you into the conversation. She was an iconic figure, so she deserves such a send-off.
It is, in effect, a state funeral in all but name, and only Winston Churchill, of all the wartime prime ministers, has received that honour and accolade. I think it's the inconsistency that grates. It looks like she's being given a privileged funeral over and above all other prime ministers. You could argue, for example, that Clement Attlee, who set up the National Health Service, the welfare state, that he was just as transformative, but he never got any comparable funeral. I think also many people don't like the whiff of militarism, the way in which the armed forces are being suborned, together with the Queen, to honour Thatcher. This really is a moment for us to sit down and agree what the form should be for all prime ministers who die.
What it is, it's recognising the fact that she was the first woman prime minister of this country. She was prime minister for 11 and a half years. She won 3 elections. And the fact that the military are involved in, well, she was a wartime prime minister. She did lead Britain into the Falklands War. And let's remember, I mean, this was a funeral that, as we've said before, was signed off by 2 Labour prime ministers. So I think there's a lot of froth about this funeral. It's all done for party political position. Not in your case, Peter, I accept that.
Nigel Willmott, what's your response to that?
I just want to say, I don't believe it is party political. I think that the feeling in large parts of the country against this scale of funeral is very visceral. And it's the kind of feeling of people whose communities, whose industries were destroyed by Thatcher. And I think
were destroyed also by themselves.
Well, that's a moot point. I mean, I don't agree. Certainly things had to change, but whether they had to change in that manner, we are now trying to rebalance our economy and bring back the industry which was destroyed.
But, I mean, it's interesting that Harold Wilson, Labour Prime Minister, he closed 8 times as many pits that were closed in the Conservative years. She didn't actually close a single pit. What she decided to do was stop subsidising them to the tune of £1 billion a year.
Now we subsidise private railway companies to the tune of several £billion a year. So, I mean, what's the difference? What advance have we made?
Peter Tatchell, I would like to get your response to the economic side of her legacy, and I suppose when Margaret Thatcher came into power, she opposed the idea of managed decline. She wanted to get Britain back on its feet. She turned things around.
Well, I agree that the economy needed to be restructured and modernised, no doubt about that, but not in the manner that she did it, not at the extraordinary price that she inflicted. Germany and France, to other European countries, modernised and restructured their economies without this incredible, terrible price. We've got to remember that her policies put over 3 million people on the dole queue. No income, no prospects. Whole industrial communities were devastated. Now, in my view, that was a price far too high, and there were alternative ways in which modernisation could have been done in a more humane manner.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing the legacy of Margaret Thatcher. With me in the studio is Iain Dale, broadcaster with LBC and author of the book Memories of Margaret Thatcher, Nigel Willmott, letters editor for The Guardian newspaper, Michael Cockerell, a journalist and BBC documentary maker who interviewed Margaret Thatcher several times, and on the line, Peter Tatchell, director of the London-based Peter Tatchell Foundation. Can I put that to Iain Dale? There were other ways. She didn't actually leave any way for these communities to get back.
Well, that's a complete myth. I mean, of course, if you look at a lot of these areas now, there is little unemployment in them. I mean, there were lots of initiatives that her government paid for to get people back into work. Yes, there were 3.5 million unemployed. Actually, a lot of those people had jobs in the 1970s, which basically masked unemployment. Yes, people were being paid to do work for industries that, frankly, shouldn't really have been in that position in the 1970s. So, I mean, I accept that it was a very, very difficult time. And we hear lots from politicians, and Peter's just said it again, it could have been done more humanely. Nobody actually explains how differently it could have been done. You can't compare Britain with Germany. Germany did all of this in the 1950s because they were rebuilding their economy after the war.
But Guardian readers don't feel that way, do they, Nigel?
No, there was an alternative. You forget that we had in 1980 the benefit of North Sea oil coming on stream. Now, we could have used that to transform our industries and rebuild our industries. But in fact, all it went into was the profits of privatised companies and mass unemployment. So there were alternative ways. That was an opportunity of a generation, almost of a lifetime, to have that benefit.
How did North Sea oil go into the profits of privatised companies? I don't follow that.
Well, the money flowed into the economy. The other industries were floated off. There was a bubble in which that money went into it.
Nothing to do with North Sea oil at all.
But remember also that Britain was in terminal decline. And if you looked at the previous Labour government before Mrs Thatcher, Michael Foot, who became leader of the Labour Party, had himself to sanction the closing of steelworks in his own constituency and was booed. And the trade unions had an extraordinary stranglehold of power over many of these declining industries.
That's true, Peter Tatchell, isn't it? I mean, there were beer and sandwiches at number 10. The strength of the unions made the country virtually ungovernable. She had to do something.
By comparison to the unions, the real power in this country does and always had lay in the hands of big business. Big corporations have always ruled this country and dictated to governments and the mass of the population. Trade unions, for whatever power they had, it was negligible.
Their power was to bring down two successive Labour government and a Tory government.
Just let Peter Tatchell finish.
Big business had power unparalleled and unmatched by any unions. I'm not saying the unions were perfect, but the unions reflected the historic battle of ordinary people to get a better deal. They didn't always run their affairs in the best way, I agree, but they were an attempt and had succeeded over many generations in uplifting the working conditions and wages of ordinary people.
Iain Dale, your response to that?
Peter, I was a teenager in the 1970s. I remember the 3-day week. I remember the trade unions having a complete stranglehold. The unions brought this country to its knees in the 1970s. How you can say that business had any influence in the 1970s is beyond me. I agree with you. Unions have a place, but they have to be democratic.
What about big business? Where is the democracy in the running of the economy? The ordinary people and consumers, employees and consumers, have no say in the running of either private corporations or public institutions. They are run on dictatorial lines. A handful of managers, directors and shareholders control the levers of big business and the economy.
What would you like to do? Nationalise them?
Undemocratic. Big business is the most undemocratic institution in Britain and always has been. And to make a comparison between the immense power of big business to close businesses, enterprises at a whim, to hire and fire workers, to arrange prices, to equate that enormous power with that of unions is simply untrue.
Michael Cockerell, you interviewed Margaret Thatcher, I understand, several times?
Yes.
Several times.
Including on the day she became leader of the party, where I brought a tear to her eyes. I asked her how she felt following in the footsteps of the great leaders of the Tory party in the past. She said, when I think of following Winston, she always called him Winston. I'm not sure. Ian may know, but I don't think she ever necessarily met Winston.
Well, they did overlap in the Commons, didn't they? So they probably did know, but I think by the time that happened, his mental capacity was, shall we say, rather diminished.
But the point is that she is often criticised for lacking compassion and on the unions, on the miners. I mean, what was your experience of her when you spoke to her about domestic issues such as this?
She said to a colleague of mine, the interviewer David Dimbleby, who asked her exactly that question, she said, when I hear people just drool and drivel that they care, I do something about it. And then David said, but isn't that exactly what's wrong? You say, you call people who are compassionate drooling and drivelling. She said, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. She immediately recognised that. But she did say the other way round, interestingly, about the wets in her cabinet. A number of millionaire left-wing old Etonian landowners. She said, I'm fed up with receiving lectures in compassion from people struggling to get by on $500,000 a year.
Peter Tatchell, there is a point, isn't there? I mean, people do talk about how Margaret Thatcher divided the nation, but she did win the hearts and votes of the aspiring working class and even the lower working class as well.
Well, she never ever won a majority of the popular vote. She only won about 43%. A clear minority, a majority of voters did not want her as Prime Minister. But she won because of the unfair electoral system that we have.
But criticisms of the first-past-the-post system aside, she did appeal to a great cross-section of the people who felt that they could own their own homes if they were in a council house.
The problem is that we are now living with the consequence of that policy in that we have a dire shortage of social housing, and there are millions of people who need housing who can't get it because the council houses have been sold off. That is a direct legacy of Margaret Thatcher's misguided policy.
The people who Margaret Thatcher appealed to in 1979, 83 and 87, they were people who were what David Cameron would call the aspirational classes, people who wanted to get on in life and had been prevented by the class system, if you like, beforehand. She did give people the opportunity to buy their own homes.
Nigel Willmott, I'd like to get your view. Despite the criticisms of Margaret Thatcher and her legacy, the incoming Labour government led by Tony Blair did nothing to roll any of that back, did they?
They didn't roll the structural changes back, which I think is the big fault of that government. They followed a policy of working with the kind of turbo capitalism that the Big Bang set up, creaming off the money from that to reinvest in infrastructure and housing and health. Over the 13-year period of that government, there were significant improvements. I canvassed most of those elections. The transformation of those old mining towns was extraordinary. And also extraordinary, in the 2010 election to hear people saying, well, what have the Labour government ever done for us? But I think the problem was it was based on quicksand. It was based on a financial bubble which eventually burst, and that model is now over, really.
But you can't blame Margaret Thatcher for that. This is the thing that's interesting. Over the last week, so many people blame Margaret Thatcher for all the ills of our society today. She left power 23 years ago. The banking regulatory system was transformed under Gordon Brown in 1997.
That's a myth.
Well, it was.
It wasn't transformed.
Well, you can't blame Margaret Thatcher for what happened in 2008.
Trying to play we would have regulated it properly in 2006, 2007, 2008 when the crisis hit. They were saying no, don't nationalise banks to save them. No, in the lead up to the crisis they were saying we need an even looser regulation. So really, the Tories turn around and say now and
but
say
the point
we
is
need better regulation.
That was 18 years on from when she left power. You can't blame her for what happened in 2008.
Well, Michael Cockerell, I'd just like to bring in you again. I mean, Margaret Thatcher did have her fair share of luck, didn't she? I mean, we've spoken about the revenues from North Sea oil. There was a split in the Labour Party at that point. The Labour Party were really not an opposition to be reckoned with. I mean, how much do you think she exploited that? And how much of a legacy is there, given the fact that it wasn't the electorate that actually got rid of her? It was her own party.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? She always said, I never lost an election. She did have her fair share of luck. And what was it Napoleon said? Give me lucky generals. She was lucky in her opponent. She was lucky with Arthur Scargill. Arthur Scargill, who decides to call a miners' strike and turn down an extraordinary deal at the start of the summer. Mrs. Thatcher had very carefully arranged for stockpiles of coal in case he called it in the winter.
When 3 years prior she actually compromised and didn't pick a fight.
Absolutely.
But that wasn't luck, that was planning.
Exactly. But I'm saying she was lucky to have as bad a general as Arthur Scargill. She was also lucky in a way with General Galtieri, because most of the people in Britain could unite behind what seemed to even, as we now know, a number of her own cabinet, a rather madcap scheme to send a task force 8,000 miles down into the South Atlantic. And she thought at that time that if she didn't do it, or if one of the carriers were hit, she would have to resign straight away. And we only won by a whisker. If the Argentinian Air Force had gone on bombing and they'd hit one of the carriers, she said, I'd have had to call it off.
But do you see that was a decisive factor in her winning the next election, though? She was deeply unpopular at that time.
It was a crucially important factor, I think.
Without that, she wouldn't have won.
According to opinion polls just before the Falklands, she was the most unpopular Prime Minister since opinion polls began. The Labour Party was split. The Social Democratic Party had 50%. And after the Falklands, she said to me one day, you people always before the Falklands, you always said, when are you going to do a U-turn? You never asked me that again.
Iain Dale.
It's not true to suggest, I believe anyway, that she wouldn't have won the election in 1983 without the Falklands. Actually, if you look at the polling data, she was out on the way up in the polls in January, February, March 1982. So I'm not saying she was ahead by any stretch of the imagination, but the graph was on an upward trajectory.
Very, very
also,
slow.
Indeed.
In January, that was the headline in the Times, the most
unpopular. Absolutely, but after that it was getting better. And
began.
Also, we don't forget the Labour Party at the time.
Exactly.
They had a leader, Michael Foot, a great man in many ways, but not a leader of a political party. The British people, frankly, would never have voted for him as Prime Minister.
Peter Tatchell, just Michael referred to the miners there, and just on the point of the miners, I mean, Arthur Scargill was as much to do with the demise of the mining industry in the United Kingdom as Thatcher was.
He made a huge mistake in not calling a ballot. That was an absolute fundamental error. But he was basically right in his predictions of what the government planned and intended. His predictions did come true, even though he was rubbished at the time. But I'd like to just move the discussion away to the international perspective, because I think that we forget that Margaret Thatcher did, in the name of fighting communism, sidle up to some very unsavoury anti-communist regimes around the world, regimes that were far from freedom-loving, such as the right-wing dictatorships in South Africa, Iraq, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, El Salvador, Indonesia, and the Philippines. These were all regimes that had committed grotesque human rights abuses, yet she gave them a green card because they were right-wing and anti-communist. And I think that was a massive, massive error of judgment.
Well, Iain Dale, that is significant, isn't it? I mean, her defence of South Africa, of the regime there, is that it was effectively a buffer against communist states surrounding her, but that's quite a significant thing.
Yet another one of those myths. So if she had actually supported apartheid, you might have a point. F.W. de Klerk, the South African president, said this morning that Margaret Thatcher was trying to persuade them to release Nelson Mandela going back to 1984. Now, the common myth is that she called Nelson Mandela a terrorist. She thought she could bring apartheid to an end in a better way than just the sort of rudimentary imposition of sanctions.
OK, but what about her support of General Pinochet in Chile and, in fact, when he was under house arrest here in the United Kingdom back in 1999?
She felt that he helped us tremendously during the Falklands War and actually put himself in a very isolated position in South America. So for her, it was very simple. It was payback.
You're being slightly disingenuous. I mean,
well, not at all.
Margaret Thatcher, she may have made some private overtures, but against the overwhelming majority...
No, she didn't Peter. She did.
Iain Dale, we'll let Peter Tatchell finish his point.
Margaret Thatcher may well have made some private overtures, but she acted against the wishes of the overwhelming majority of the British people and the Commonwealth, in that people wanted sanctions, as the majority of South African people themselves did. She fought against sanctions
and she was right.
time and time again. And it wasn't just that she defended General Pinochet. She defended and praised him for so-called restoring democracy. This was monstrous for her to say such things, to oppose his prosecution for clearly documented human rights abuses.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing the legacy of Margaret Thatcher with Iain Dale, Nigel Willmott, Peter Tatchell and Michael Cockerell. I'd just like to get your view, Nigel Willmott, on the end of the Cold War. And she famously said that Mikhail Gorbachev was somebody with whom she could do business. That's a significant legacy, isn't it?
I think that is probably a significant legacy. I think the problem in the Soviet Union came after all those initial overtures and the opening up. It was the wish of a neoliberal establishment in America to really deconstruct the Soviet Union as quickly as possible and to privatize all the assets which were done at, knock down rates, which produced the oligarchs and many of the problems that Russia and the succeeding states have. You see, there is a long legacy. Legacies do go on. And I'm not sure that Thatcher herself was the person who drove that. I think that was more driven by America and the people that they sent to the Soviet.
So a legacy of privatisation felt far beyond Britain's borders, Iain Dale.
Well, yes, it did. I mean, that was one of her greatest exports around the world, not just in the Soviet Union, but all sorts of places. But again, all of that happened after she left power. I don't think there was anyone in this country, or indeed America, who thought in 1986 or whatever, when Gorbachev first came in, right, this is what we'll do, and then we'll privatise all the Russian... Nobody foresaw the end of communism. She identified Gorbachev, and I think she was instrumental in building that relationship with President Reagan. Of course, her role wasn't as important as Reagan's was, or indeed Gorbachev's was. But without her, I think it might have taken a little bit more time.
Michael Cockerell, just on the funeral and the aftermath of that, as well as the upcoming election in 2015, the word division has been bandied about a lot. Do you think that there is a danger that those who felt damaged by Thatcherism might suddenly remember why they didn't like the Conservative Party so much, and this may have some kind of impact in the run-up to the 2015 election?
Well, there's a fascinating sort of paradox here that David Cameron, for many years after he became leader, sought to, as he put it, detoxify the Conservative brand, and one of the ways of detoxifying it was changing the memory or the image of the Tory party in the eyes of many people as the nasty party, as the party of Thatcherism. And almost directly he said that he was disavowing Thatcherism. He didn't say it in so many words, but it was absolutely clear. And then last week in the House of Commons, he made this wonderful eulogy to Mrs. Thatcher. So there's what they call a cognitive dissonance going on about the Tory party now.
Iain Dale, isn't there the danger, though, that people in the restive elements of David Cameron's backbenchers will suddenly realise that he's not the winner that she was?
The facts speak for themselves. He isn't the winner that she was. She won 3 elections. He hasn't won a single election. The Conservatives haven't won an election in this country
but that would
since
ultimately damage him in
2015.
2015, won't it?
Well, I don't know. It depends what he does between now and then. I mean, he says, well, let's respect the legacy of Margaret Thatcher, but of course today is very different from the 1980s. The challenges that we face are very different from the 1980s. You can learn the lessons from Thatcherism, but you can't just adopt Thatcherite policies in 2013 or 2015. Now, that's a sensible approach to take.
Nigel Willmott, do you see David Cameron and the present Conservative Party ever emerging from the shadow of this giant?
I think the long-term effect of all this will be negligible, really. I don't think it will have any great impact on the polls. I think this is more about the Conservative Party than it is about the wider country. It's about Cameron trying to solidify support with a very, very fractious right wing. And I think when it's all died down, I think we'll be back where we were before, and the real issues.
And the interesting thing is that Ed Miliband, the Labour leader, to me, looks to have the more conviction about it than any of the others. And I mean, she won elections because she was a conviction politician. And if he can take that lesson from Margaret Thatcher, Ed Miliband might do quite well at the next election.
Peter Tatchell, just finally, what do you think about this proposal for a statue in the centre of London?
Well, I wouldn't be in favour of it myself, but I can understand why people might want a statue, and in a free society they have every right to do so. And yes, she was an iconic figure, loved by many people, loathed by many others. But I would just say that on this eve of her funeral, I defend the right of people to protest against her policies and memory. I defend their right to protest on the day of her funeral, but I hope that it will be dignified. I hope they will give Margaret Thatcher the dignity in death that she denied to so many millions of people in her life.
Iain Dale, quickly.
Well, I agree with the first part of that. I think there is a right of protest in this country, and as long as it's carried out in a dignified way, that should be good. I hate this idea that the police are preemptively going round arresting people before they've actually done anything. Margaret Thatcher would hate that. I mean, she would actually take it as a tribute to her, these sort of so-called celebratory death parties, this song that got to the number 2 in the charts, Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead. She would have found that hilariously funny and as a tribute. She wouldn't care about the fact there were protests.
Maybe Michael Cockerell were a bit too sensitive about the song Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead that Iain mentions. She would have seen the funny side of that, perhaps.
She didn't have a great sense of humour. I mean, Margaret Thatcher's jokes were no laughing matter. I mean, interestingly, on Voice of Russia, I should say that when in 1977, fairly soon after she'd become leader, the Red Star newspaper said that she was a cold warrior. She is an iron lady. She saw this reported in the press and said it was awful. But her spin doctor said, "Oh no, Margaret, it's exactly right. It's the combination of toughness and femininity that you need. You call yourself an iron lady from now on." So it's interesting that the Red Star gave her epitaph.
Nigel Willmott, it was a Russian or Soviet newspaper that called her the Iron Lady. That's the legacy, I guess, of that's a moniker that she's kept to this day. But does she deserve a statue?
I like Peter. I don't mind really. It's the scale which of things being done for, I think, party political purposes. But
just one point. It's also said that this week, since her death, has been the longest Tory party political broadcast in history. Yeah. If it has, it's been the best, because most party political broadcasts are very one-sided propaganda, and there's been great fun as well as the sadness.
We'll see if that party political broadcast will result in a bounce for the Conservative Party. I'd just like to thank you all very much for joining me. Michael Cockerell, journalist and BBC documentary maker who interviewed Margaret Thatcher several times. Also in the studio, LBC broadcaster and author of the book Memories of Margaret Thatcher, Iain Dale. Also joining me here is Nigel Willmott, letters editor for The Guardian newspaper. And on the line, Peter Tatchell, human rights campaigner. Thank you all very much for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia.